December 16th, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay frozen under snow, silent except for the muffled breath of men and machines waiting in fog. In that silence, an army gathered its strength for one last gamble. 250,000 German soldiers, with more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, prepared to break through the thin American lines in Belgium. Adolf Hitler had chosen this place for his counteroffensive, believing that if the Germans could reach Antwerp, they would split the Allies, shatter morale, and perhaps force a negotiated peace. The plan was bold, but beneath the ambition lay a fatal weakness that even the most loyal commanders whispered about in secret. The entire operation balanced not on guns or men, but on fuel. Germany in 1944 was a nation running on empty. Its natural oil reserves had never been enough, and by this stage of the war, Allied bombers had smashed the synthetic fuel plants that once sustained the Wehrmacht. Luftwaffe pilots trained on wooden mock-ups because flying consumed precious gasoline. Tank crews counted every liter. Generals studied maps not for terrain but for fuel depots. Yet Hitler promised his commanders that fuel would be taken from the Americans. They would advance until their tanks ran dry, and then they would refill from captured stockpiles. It was a strategy closer to banditry than to war, but desperation left no choice. At 5:30 in the morning, the silence shattered. German artillery opened fire with more than 1,600 guns, shells screaming through fog to smash into American positions. Trees splintered, dugouts collapsed, and young soldiers who had thought this a quiet sector of the front suddenly found themselves in hell. Through the smoke, infantry surged forward, slipping between the shattered lines, cutting communications, overwhelming small pockets of resistance. Among the attackers came the most feared formation of all, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division under the command of Joachim Peiper. Peiper was young, ruthless, and fanatically loyal. His Kampfgruppe carried over 100 tanks, including the monstrous King Tiger. The King Tiger was the pride of German engineering, a 70-ton giant with an 88mm gun capable of destroying a Sherman tank from 2 miles away. Its armor was nearly invulnerable, but it had a flaw no engineer could overcome. It was thirsty beyond imagination, burning more than 5 gallons of fuel for every mile cross-country. Even with a full tank, it could travel no more than 60 miles before needing more. Peiper knew from the first kilometer that his advance was measured not in miles but in gallons. Yet in those opening hours, the advance went well. American units in the Ardennes were green, understrength, or resting after months of pursuit across France. The fog concealed German movement, and where resistance appeared, it was swept aside by tanks and armored infantry. By nightfall, Peiper's men had advanced through villages like Lanzerath and Hansfeld, capturing supplies and prisoners. But already fuel was a shadow on every decision. Engines idled in long traffic jams on icy roads, wasting precious gasoline. Blown bridges forced detours that drained reserves. The Luftwaffe, grounded for lack of aviation fuel, could not protect the spearhead from roving American fighter bombers once the skies cleared. The dream of Antwerp was 100 miles west, but by the second day, Peiper's column had barely reached 40. Fuel dictated everything. At Billingen, his men discovered an American dump with 50,000 gallons of gasoline, and for a moment, jubilation filled the ranks. Soldiers siphoned furiously, filling tanks and cans, laughing as if they had discovered water in a desert. But the celebration could not hide the truth. 50,000 gallons might seem immense, but for a force of over 100 tanks and hundreds of vehicles, it meant only another day's advance. The arithmetic was merciless. Meanwhile, the Americans possessed fuel in quantities the Germans could scarcely comprehend. Since the summer, the Red Ball Express had carried supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines in endless convoys. 6,000 trucks thundered day and night along roads reserved for them alone, delivering more than 12,000 tons of supplies daily at the system's peak. Fuel was the lifeblood of these convoys. Some companies moved 50,000 gallons in a single day. Drivers joked that they burned more fuel driving their trucks than the Germans possessed for entire divisions. Spillage, leaks, and overfilled tanks were shrugged off. Where the Germans counted every drop, the Americans measured their reserves in oceans. By December, the Americans had gone further still, completing Operation Pluto, the undersea pipeline carrying petroleum directly from Britain to the continent. From the coast, a growing web of pipelines snaked across France and Belgium, feeding depots that swelled with millions of gallons. Near Spa and Stavelot alone, reservoirs contained over 3 million gallons, more than the Germans had allocated for their entire offensive. American engineers treated fuel like blood, pumping it through a circulatory system that could not be cut by weather or enemy attack. German commanders were painfully aware of the disparity. Staff calculations before the offensive had shown they possessed enough gasoline for perhaps 6 days of combat operations. They might reach the Meuse River, but they could not cross it, let alone continue to Antwerp without capturing American supplies intact. One officer admitted later that the offensive was less a military operation than a desperate raid, hoping to steal what the Reich could no longer produce. Piper pressed onward, but with every mile the shortage grew worse. At Stavelot, American engineers blew bridges in his path just as his lead tanks arrived, forcing long detours through icy valleys. Tigers and Panthers stood nose to tail on narrow forest roads, their engines idling, wasting gallons they could not spare. Prisoners captured along the way were sometimes forced to help refuel vehicles before being executed, one of many war crimes later tied to the desperation of fuel scarcity. By December 18th, scarcely 48 hours into the offensive, Piper's column was already stalling. The irony was brutal. Less than 10 miles from his lead elements lay American depots holding millions of gallons. But the bridges were gone, the roads blocked, the defenders stubborn. The prize he needed most was visible, yet unreachable. German crews shivered beside their tanks, listening to the cough of engines running dry. The distance to Antwerp was still more than 80 miles, but their fuel gauges already pointed toward defeat. Officers tried to calculate how far the remaining gasoline might take them. The numbers mocked their ambitions. A Panther battalion consumed 15,000 gallons to advance only 30 miles in combat. A single King Tiger drank half a tank just maneuvering off-road for a few hours. The entire allocation for Kampfgruppe Piper, 180,000 gallons, was enough for one major engagement and little more. The promise of Antwerp was fading into fantasy, yet the Americans wasted fuel with casual indifference. Sherman crews left engines running through the night to stay warm in the freezing cold. Jeeps made 2-block trips rather than having soldiers walk. Field kitchens, movie projectors, and electric lights burned gasoline as if it were air. German prisoners who saw these habits sometimes broke down in despair. One begged to collect discarded fuel in his canteen, whispering that he was watching his country's grave. The first days of the offensive had shown the contrast in its starkest form. German forces possessed powerful tanks, experienced crews, and the element of surprise. But their advance was shackled by empty fuel gauges. The Americans, caught off guard and scattered, had one inexhaustible ally: gasoline. What began as a daring gamble was already becoming a slow-motion catastrophe. The fog of the Ardennes hid the battlefield, but beneath that fog, invisible and decisive, was the imbalance of petroleum that would determine everything to come. The fog that had hidden the German advance on the first day began to lift. Low winter sun broke through the trees, casting long shadows across snow and ice. With the clearing skies came the greatest enemy the Germans could face: American fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings prowled the roads, their machine guns and rockets striking columns trapped in endless traffic jams. The forest echoed with the scream of engines and the crack of strafing runs. For the Germans, every delay on the ground was now paid for in gasoline and blood. Joachim Piper's column pressed forward, his tanks rumbling toward the villages of Stavelot and Trois Ponts. Each mile gained brought them closer to the American fuel depots that could save the offensive. Yet each mile also consumed what little gasoline remained. The men grew anxious, checking gauges, siphoning from abandoned vehicles, searching barns and garages for hidden cans. One Tiger tank was left behind, not because it was destroyed, but because it simply could not drink enough to keep moving. Crews abandoned it by the roadside, a steel giant defeated not by shells but by an empty tank. At Stavelot, the Americans fought with desperate courage. Engineers blew bridges as German tanks approached, sending timbers and stone crashing into icy rivers. Piper's men tried to cross, but the delays piled up. Detours sent them into bottlenecks where artillery found them. As hours slipped away, the chance to capture the enormous depots beyond the town began to vanish. Piper raged at his officers, urging speed, but speed was impossible on frozen mountain roads choked with wrecks and refugees. For every hour wasted, gallons vanished into the throats of idling engines. The Americans understood instinctively what their enemy sought. Orders went out to destroy fuel reserves before they could be captured. Drivers set fire to storage tanks, turning villages into seas of flame. The black smoke of burning gasoline rose like funeral pyres into the cold sky. Piper's men reached Stavelot only to find infernos where salvation had once waited. In Trois Ponts, the story was the same. Bridges blown, fuel burned, defenders clinging to every corner. The advance slowed to a crawl. The frustration was unbearable. So close, yet so far. Millions of gallons lay in American hands just beyond the rivers, enough to feed the entire German army for months. But Piper could not reach them. Instead, he ordered his column forward without pause, demanding momentum even as his tanks sputtered and slowed. To fuel the vanguard, rear vehicles were drained dry. Trucks and half-tracks were abandoned, stripped of their gasoline to keep the Panthers moving. Soldiers marched through snow on foot, watching their vehicles stand silent along the roadside. The stress of shortage seeped into every action. Food was scarce, ammunition short, but nothing compared to the desperation for fuel. In some villages, German soldiers seized local civilians, demanding to know where gasoline might be hidden. Barns were ransacked, wells searched, cellars emptied. The few gallons sometimes found barely filled a motorcycle or jeep. It was never enough for the hungry giants of steel. Every captured American convoy was torn apart in frantic hope, but usually the trucks carried rations or winter clothing, not the liquid gold the Germans needed. On December 17th, Piper's men committed one of the war's darkest atrocities. At Bonnier Crossroads near Malmedy, more than 80 American prisoners of war were shot after surrendering. The massacre shocked the world and became a symbol of German brutality in the Ardennes. Historians later argued about motives, whether it was deliberate policy, loss of discipline, or the stress of command. But some survivors recalled hearing German officers shouting about delays, about fuel, about the need to push forward without the burden of prisoners. In the bitter calculus of desperation, even human lives were measured against the value of gasoline. American resistance stiffened with each passing day. Reinforcements poured into the Ardennes, infantry rushed by truck, tanks redeployed from quieter sectors, paratroopers thrown in straight from England. What had begun as a thin, fragile line became a wall of firepower. Everywhere the Germans turned, they found bridges gone, roads blocked, supplies burned before they could be seized. Piper's men grew exhausted. Their once proud column stretched thin along icy roads, vulnerable to attack from every side. By December 20th, the dream of Antwerp was fading rapidly. Piper's advance had carried him further west than any other German force, yet he was isolated, cut off from supply lines, and nearly out of fuel. American units struck from all sides, pressing the spearhead into a pocket around the villages of La Glaise and Stoumont. His tanks, once the terror of the battlefield, now stood silent in snowy fields, their engines lifeless. Crews huddled beside them for warmth, rifles clutched in numb hands, waiting for orders that could never be carried out. The decision came quickly. With no fuel, no hope of resupply, and enemy forces closing in, Piper ordered a breakout on foot. Hundreds of men slipped into the forests under cover of night, abandoning more than 100 vehicles, including precious King Tigers and Panthers. They carried only what they could on their backs, leaving behind the pride of German armor as monuments to a failed offensive. American soldiers who entered La Glaise in the following days found the roads littered with tanks. Their great cannons pointed at nothing, their hatches open, their engines cold. The abandonment marked more than the end of one column. It symbolized the collapse of the offensive itself. Without fuel, the German dream of breaking through to Antwerp had died. Other units fought on, struggling toward the Meuse River, but they too ran short. Some divisions rationed gasoline so tightly that entire battalions remained immobile, waiting for a trickle of supply that never came. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had stormed across Europe in 1939 and 1940, now stumbled in the snow, its mobility shackled, its steel legions paralyzed. For the Americans, the contrast could not have been sharper. Fuel flowed like a river from depots and pipelines, feeding tanks and trucks in endless numbers. Shermans rolled forward in fresh waves, their engines roaring confidently. Supply convoys stretched for miles, headlights glowing against the snow as gasoline, ammunition, and food poured into the front. Soldiers joked that the only thing they lacked was sleep. To the Germans, watching this abundance was like staring into another world, one where war was won not only on battlefields but in the factories, pipelines, and convoys that never ceased. The German leadership had gambled everything on the hope of stealing what they could not produce. The offensive was meant to restore initiative, to shock the Allies into fear, to fracture their unity. Instead, it revealed the terrible truth. Germany no longer possessed the resources to wage modern war. Fuel, the most vital resource of all, was gone. The tanks that had once symbolized invincibility now stood rusting in Belgian fields. Their defeat not written by enemy shells, but by the silence of empty engines. Piper himself escaped the pocket with a fraction of his men, trudging eastward through snow and forest to rejoin German lines. He had begun the offensive with one of the most powerful armored groups in the world. He ended it with nothing but exhausted survivors, their faces hollow, their uniforms torn, their pride shattered. The King Tigers lay behind him, monuments to futility. The Ardennes, intended as a road to victory, had become a graveyard of machines and men buried under snow and the weight of impossible dreams, and yet the battle raged on. The German army still fought with ferocity, clinging to villages, ambushing convoys, striking where fuel and ammunition still allowed. But the momentum had gone. Every day the skies cleared more, and with the sun came the thunder of American aircraft. Every gallon of fuel burned by the Germans could not be replaced, while every gallon burned by the Americans was replaced tenfold. The imbalance was final, irreversible, and fatal. The Ardennes offensive had begun with a roar of artillery and the thunder of tanks. It was ending with the cough of dying engines, the silence of abandoned columns, and the slow retreat of men who had gambled on capturing fuel and failed. The world's most powerful army had been defeated not only by enemy soldiers, but by mathematics, logistics, and oil. In the snowbound forests of Belgium, history had shown that no army, no matter how brave or skilled, could march further than its fuel tanks allowed. The snow deepened as December wore on, blanketing the Ardennes in a silence that seemed almost cruel. Beneath that silence, however, the war was changing. The German offensive, which had begun with such fury, was losing its edge. Tanks that had once roared forward now stood frozen in the woods, their tracks half buried. Soldiers who had marched with the promise of Antwerp on their lips now crouched in cellars and barns, fighting not for victory, but for survival. The fuel that had driven their gamble was gone, and without it the great thrust westward had stalled into frustration. Yet Hitler demanded more. From his headquarters, he raged at generals who spoke of shortages, insisting that his armies must push to the Meuse River at any cost. He refused to believe that fuel had become an insurmountable barrier, clinging instead to dreams of captured depots and broken Allied morale. Orders flowed outward with the same urgency as the first day of the attack, but the men in the snow knew better. Orders could not make gasoline appear. No speech, no decree, no promise could fill an empty tank. The Americans, meanwhile, adapted quickly. What had begun as chaos, units scattered, roads clogged with retreating vehicles, commanders struggling to piece together the front, soon hardened into determination. Reinforcements streamed in from every direction. General Eisenhower redirected divisions from quiet sectors. Patton's Third Army, already preparing to swing north, moved with astonishing speed, its tanks and trucks fueled by an unbroken chain of supply that seemed limitless. The American army fought not only with courage, but with the confidence of abundance. In villages like Bastogne, surrounded and besieged by German forces, the story of resistance took on legendary form. The 101st Airborne held firm against repeated assaults, their positions bombarded, their lines probed. German officers demanded their surrender, confident that isolation and hunger would break them. The reply came in a single word that traveled through the frozen air like a spark of defiance: nuts. The defenders fought on. Supplied not by captured resources but by the steady flow of American logistics, including daring airdrops that brought food, ammunition, and yes, fuel, even through clouds of snow and enemy fire. For the Germans outside Bastogne, every shell fired and every tank maneuvered drained their reserves further. Attempts to surround and crush the town meant longer drives through the snow, more engines running, more gasoline consumed without hope of replacement. The irony was harsh. Even if Bastogne fell, the Wehrmacht would have no strength left to exploit the victory. Every day spent in siege was another day of starvation for their machines. As the skies cleared fully, American air power returned in overwhelming force. Waves of bombers and fighters struck bridges, roads, and columns. German supply lines, already thin, were shattered completely. Trucks that might have brought the last barrels of fuel to the front were destroyed in fireballs along icy highways. Crews abandoned their vehicles and tried to roll fuel drums by hand through the snow, only to be strafed from above. The Luftwaffe, grounded for lack of aviation fuel, could only watch. Pilots begged to take off, but the tanks of their Messerschmitts were dry. The imbalance reached absurd levels. In one report, an entire German regiment was ordered to hold a line, but only half the vehicles could move because the other half had no fuel. In another, an armored battalion sat idle while its commander begged for just a few hundred gallons, enough to shift his tanks into a more defensible position. None came. Soldiers tore apart abandoned vehicles for parts and for the gasoline left in their tanks, but the amounts were pitiful, enough for a few miles at most. American soldiers advancing through the Ardennes were stunned by what they found. Villages littered with massive tanks, abandoned intact, their crews gone. Vehicles left with keys in the ignition, radios still humming faintly, tracks frozen in place. The King Tiger, once thought invincible, became a roadside monument, useless without the liquid that fed its engine. Infantrymen joked that the Germans had given them gifts for Christmas, steel beasts too heavy to move but trophies nonetheless. The collapse spread like cracks in ice. With Piper's column destroyed, the spearhead gone, other German units faltered. Some divisions fought desperately to cross the Meuse but were stopped short, their fuel so low they could not regroup for another attempt. Others turned defensive, digging in where they stood, trying to hold territory they could no longer advance beyond. The dream of reaching Antwerp was dead, though Hitler still refused to admit it. What remained was a slow retreat, covered by stubborn rear guards, and bought with the blood of men whose tanks could no longer carry them. The Allies pressed the advantage. Convoys poured gasoline to the front in such quantities that commanders scarcely needed to ration it. Trucks lined up bumper to bumper, their engines idling as they waited to unload drums and cans. American tank units advanced without hesitation, secure in the knowledge that fuel would always be waiting. When one depot ran low, another opened its stores. The system seemed infinite, a reflection of the industrial might of the United States, which by that winter was producing more petroleum than all of Europe combined. German soldiers captured in the Ardennes often spoke not of American weapons, but of American fuel. They described with disbelief how jeeps and trucks seemed to run endlessly, how supply convoys arrived with clockwork precision, how engines never fell silent. Some admitted that the sight of such abundance destroyed their will to fight more than any bullet. They realized they were not simply battling soldiers, but an entire economy, a nation whose oil fields and factories guaranteed that its armies would never run dry. By New Year's Eve, the offensive was collapsing completely. German gains melted away as Allied counterattacks surged forward. The bulge in the lines, once a threatening spear, shrank back into the forests where it had begun. Villages that had flown German flags days earlier now echoed with American voices. Snow drifts covered the hulks of abandoned armor, burying them like tombstones in white. For the men who had believed in victory, the Ardennes became a graveyard of hope. Still, the fighting was savage to the end. German units fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant not safety, but annihilation. Yet even bravery could not compensate for emptiness. Guns without shells were silent, tanks without fuel were statues, and armies without supply were shadows. The Battle of the Bulge, intended as Germany's last great strike, ended as a testament to the power of logistics. The world would remember Bastogne, the Malmedy massacre, the frozen forests, and the brutal cold. But behind every story lay the same truth. Fuel had determined the outcome. The Germans had launched an offensive without the means to sustain it, gambling that capture would solve what production could not. The Americans, with their oceans of petroleum and their mastery of transport, had turned fuel into a weapon as decisive as any gun. When the last shots faded in January 1945, the German army was broken. Tens of thousands of men were lost, along with irreplaceable tanks and vehicles. The Reich had squandered its final reserves in an offensive that never had a chance to succeed. What remained was retreat, defeat, and the slow realization that the war was lost. The Ardennes had proven not that Germany was strong, but that its strength had hollowed out, consumed by the emptiness of its fuel tanks. January came with bitter winds and snowdrifts so deep they swallowed entire vehicles, yet the Allied advance did not slow. Where German tanks froze in the woods, American engines roared steadily, fed by convoys that never ceased. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive left the Wehrmacht not only defeated but gutted. The last reserves of armor and fuel had been sacrificed in the gamble for Antwerp. What remained was a broken army stumbling back toward the Siegfried Line, pursued relentlessly by forces that seemed inexhaustible. For the Americans, the new year was not simply about survival, but about seizing momentum. The Red Ball Express had been replaced by new supply networks, pipelines reaching forward, depots rising out of farmland and villages. Each day brought more gasoline than the day before, until commanders no longer asked whether they had enough fuel, but only how quickly they could move. Trucks ran continuously, headlights cutting through the night, delivering the lifeblood of modern war. The German retreat became a chase in which only one side had the means to keep running. The towns and villages of Belgium bore witness to this change. In December, they had trembled under German occupation once again, the sound of tanks rumbling down cobbled streets. By mid-January, the same streets thundered with American convoys, Sherman tanks clattering past lines of civilians who watched with relief and disbelief. Children waved at passing jeeps, and soldiers tossed them candy bars and chewing gum. But the gifts most remembered were the drums of gasoline stacked in endless pyramids along the roads, visible proof that liberation was carried not just on rifles, but in the flow of petroleum. The Germans tried desperately to regroup. Commanders ordered counterattacks to stabilize the line, but the reality was harsh. Vehicles without fuel could not be shifted to new positions. Artillery batteries lacked shells and transport. Infantry marched on foot, exhausted, across frozen terrain while American units traveled by truck, moving faster than the retreating enemy. The imbalance widened daily. It was not simply a matter of strength, but of speed, of one side able to maneuver freely while the other stumbled in slow retreat. Hitler's fury grew as reports arrived. He accused generals of cowardice, of defeatism, of failing to exploit opportunities. In truth, there were no opportunities left. The Reich's oil industry lay in ruins. Synthetic plants bombed into rubble could not provide even a fraction of what was needed. Stockpiles were empty, and trains carrying what little remained were destroyed by Allied bombers before they reached the front. Commanders begged for fuel allocations measured in barrels, while American officers casually requested thousands of gallons for a single battalion. The gulf was no longer strategic. It was absolute. American soldiers noticed it everywhere. In captured villages, they found German tanks abandoned with their guns unfired, not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. They discovered horse-drawn wagons pressed into service where trucks should have been, evidence of an army regressing into the past while fighting a modern enemy. Prisoners spoke openly of shortages, admitting that their rations were thin, their boots worn, their weapons unreliable, but always they returned to the same complaint: Without fuel, there could be no war. At Bastogne, the relief of the 101st Airborne became a symbol of American strength. Patton's Third Army had turned north in record time, covering more than 100 miles through snow and ice in just a few days. The maneuver consumed nearly 1 million gallons of fuel, more than the entire German allocation for the Ardennes offensive. Yet for the Americans, it was merely another task completed. Fuel depots along the route provided everything needed. The very act of rescuing the surrounded paratroopers showed the enemy that no matter how bold their plans, they could not match the sheer power of American logistics. The Luftwaffe attempted one final gesture of defiance on New Year's Day, launching Operation Bodenplatte, a massive attack on Allied airfields. Hundreds of German fighters roared across the skies, strafing runways, destroying aircraft on the ground. For a moment, it seemed as though the Reich still possessed teeth. But the victory was short-lived. Losses among German pilots were catastrophic, and the fuel expended could never be replaced. Within days, the skies belonged to the Allies once again, their planes taking off with tanks full, while the Luftwaffe's squadrons dwindled into silence. On the ground, American engineers worked tirelessly to extend pipelines eastward. Fuel no longer needed to travel entirely by truck. Underground arteries carried it directly to forward depots, where pumps filled cans and drums with mechanical efficiency. Soldiers joked that gasoline flowed like water in their army, that they could bathe in it if they wished. The exaggeration carried truth. Supply was so abundant that commanders planned offensives without fear of shortages, while German generals agonized over whether their tanks could even reach the starting line of a counterattack. By mid-January, the Ardennes front had stabilized. The bulge created by Hitler's offensive was erased, and Allied forces pressed once more toward the Rhine. For the Germans, the price had been catastrophic. More than 600 tanks and assault guns were lost, many abandoned intact. Thousands of trucks and half-tracks were destroyed or left behind. Entire divisions were gutted, their men captured or scattered. The Wehrmacht had spent its last gamble and emerged crippled. What followed was not recovery, but collapse. In the ruins of abandoned vehicles, American troops often found signs of desperation. Crews had tried to siphon the last drops from their machines, hoses still hanging from open tanks. Some tanks had been destroyed deliberately, their engines intact but their fuel tanks empty. Others had simply been left behind, their crews marching eastward with what little equipment they could carry. The once feared panzers were now little more than hulks rusting in the snow, monuments to a strategy defeated by arithmetic. The people of Belgium and Luxembourg watched this transformation with awe. Only weeks earlier, they had seen German armor roll through their streets with an air of invincibility. Now those same machines sat silent, abandoned by men who once seemed unstoppable. In their place came Americans who burned fuel so casually that villagers could scarcely comprehend it. Trucks idled for hours, engines running simply to keep soldiers warm. Generators powered lights, radios, and even movie projectors in towns still reeling from battle. To civilians who had endured years of scarcity, the abundance was staggering. As the Allies advanced toward the Siegfried Line, the question was no longer whether Germany could be defeated, but how soon. The Ardennes had cost the Reich its last armored reserve. Without fuel, there could be no new offensive, no miracle to turn the tide. Factories could produce weapons, but without gasoline, they were useless. Hitler had gambled on capturing Allied supplies, but abundance cannot be stolen. It must be created, and creation was beyond Germany's reach. American officers understood this clearly. They spoke openly of the war as a contest of supply, of factories and oil fields as decisive as battlefields. Colonels measured success not only by ground taken, but by gallons delivered. Generals planned offensives around depots and pipelines as much as around rivers and roads. To them, the collapse of the Ardennes was proof that victory belonged to the side that could fuel its machines without pause. The Germans retreated behind the Siegfried Line, hoping to hold at least the western frontier of the Reich. But their defenses were brittle, manned by exhausted troops and supported by machines that could not move freely. Every counterattack was limited not by courage but by fuel. When commanders requested maneuvers, they were told there was no gasoline to spare. When units tried to redeploy, they often had to abandon half their vehicles on the roadside. By late January, the Allies pressed forward everywhere. Eisenhower's staff calculated fuel stocks in the tens of millions of gallons, arriving faster than they could be consumed. Divisions rotated freely, tanks rolled without pause, trucks carried supplies in endless columns stretching to the horizon. Germany's defeat was no longer in doubt. The only question was how many more lives it would cost. The Battle of the Bulge had begun as Hitler's last gamble to split the Allies, to seize Antwerp, to shatter morale. It ended as a demonstration of American strength, of an army whose true weapon was not just courage or firepower, but gasoline. In the snowy forests of the Ardennes, it became clear that modern war was not won by the side with the boldest plan, but by the side that could fuel its plan to completion. The Reich had none left to give. The Americans had oceans. The result was inevitable. February arrived with skies heavy and gray, but for the Allies, the road ahead was clear. The Ardennes gamble was over, the last German offensive broken, and now the armies of the West looked across the Siegfried Line toward the heart of Germany itself. For months, they had been slowed by weather and distance, but never again by shortages. Fuel flowed without end, delivered by truck, rail, and pipeline until it seemed the entire continent had been wired with arteries of gasoline. Commanders planned not in days of supply, but in horizons of possibility. The German army that faced them was a shadow of its former self. Divisions shattered in the Ardennes were patched together with raw recruits and weary veterans, but they could not recover what mattered most. Factories might still build tanks, but without fuel, those tanks sat idle. Luftwaffe fields still held aircraft, but they rarely flew. The Reich had become a fortress without walls, filled with weapons that could not move, and soldiers who could not strike where they wished. The war of maneuver had ended for Germany. Only retreat and defense remained. For the Americans, fuel was freedom. Patton's Third Army surged forward again, maneuvering with the speed of a cavalry charge. In a single month, his columns consumed more than 4 million gallons of gasoline, a figure so vast it seemed surreal. Yet depots provided more without hesitation. Trucks idled at crossroads, waiting for orders, their engines burning fuel simply to keep warm. Tanks ran patrols with no specific objective other than to deny the enemy rest. The abundance allowed an extravagance of movement that German commanders could scarcely imagine. The Siegfried Line, once spoken of as a wall of steel and concrete, was pierced again and again. American artillery pounded bunkers until they cracked. Engineers blasted through dragons' teeth and barbed wire, and behind them came the rolling tide of mechanized divisions. The Germans fought with stubbornness, but each day revealed the same truth. They lacked the mobility to respond. A breakthrough on one sector could not be countered because the tanks to do so had no fuel to reach the battlefield. Infantry marched for days only to arrive too late, while American units covered the same distance in hours. By March, the Rhine River loomed as the last great barrier. Hitler ordered that every bridge be destroyed, that no crossing be allowed, for he believed the river would buy him time. Yet fate betrayed him. At Remagen, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, damaged but intact, and American troops seized it in a sudden rush. Within hours, engineers were swarming across, reinforcing the foothold, while German commanders raged at the disaster. They threw everything they had at the bridge: artillery, aircraft, even V-2 rockets, but the Americans poured fuel and men across faster than the enemy could destroy them. What should have been an impassable barrier became instead a highway into the heart of Germany. Fuel made the miracle possible. Without gasoline, the bridgehead could not have been supplied, tanks could not have surged across, and artillery could not have followed. But with convoys delivering endlessly, the foothold expanded until entire armies pressed eastward. The German counterattack sputtered, hampered by shortages so dire that tanks sometimes drove into battle with only half-filled tanks, forced to abandon the fight before it began. The contrast was devastating, not just militarily but psychologically. Soldiers knew they were beaten not by bravery or skill but by the sheer fact that their enemy never ran out. As March turned to April, the Rhine crossings multiplied. Montgomery's forces staged a vast, deliberate assault in the north, ferries and pontoons carrying divisions across under the cover of artillery fire. Patton, impatient, drove his men across in multiple places, his columns roaring into central Germany with astonishing speed. Everywhere fuel followed. Pipelines were laid across the river almost as quickly as bridges. Within days, the supply of gasoline was as reliable east of the Rhine as it had been in Normandy months before. The Americans had turned the greatest river of Europe into no more than another obstacle to be bridged by logistics. German towns fell one after another, some resisting, many surrendering without a fight. Civilians emerged from cellars to watch convoys roll past, the endless rumble of engines echoing through streets that had once known only silence. To them, the American army appeared less like a human force than like a machine powered by fuel, its strength measured in gallons rather than battalions. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, moved on foot, its retreating columns trudging along roads littered with burned-out vehicles that had run dry. The difference was so stark that soldiers on both sides knew the end was approaching. The Ruhr industrial region, once the beating heart of German industry, became a trap. Surrounded by American and British forces, entire armies were cut off. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were captured, their weapons useless, their vehicles abandoned. Prisoners admitted openly that they had no hope. Some had received no fuel for weeks, ordered to fight with rifles while their tanks stood rusting in barns. They surrendered not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked the means to continue. American soldiers, weary but relentless, pressed on toward the Elbe. Supply columns stretched behind them, unbroken, a river of motion that reached back to French ports and English harbors. Across the Atlantic to the refineries of Texas and Louisiana, the war was now a matter of time, and time favored the side with oceans of oil. Eisenhower urged caution, refusing to risk unnecessary losses when victory was already assured. Patton demanded speed, convinced the war could end in weeks. Yet both relied on the same certainty, that fuel would never fail them. The German people, too, felt the absence. Streets that once echoed with the clatter of trucks and the rumble of tanks now lay quiet. Civilians scavenged for scraps of coal and wood, for anything to keep warm as fuel vanished from daily life. Cities starved while across the front American units burned gasoline in quantities so vast they seemed wasteful. Generators powered lights through the night. Field kitchens boiled coffee without pause, and vehicles ran even when standing still. The contrast was unbearable. For the Reich, scarcity meant collapse. For the Americans, abundance meant unstoppable progress. By April, the Allies stood deep inside Germany. Soviet armies closed in from the east, their own supply lines stretching but still fueled by vast deliveries from Allied convoys through Iran and Murmansk. The Reich was surrounded not just by armies, but by the resources of the world. Hitler raged in his bunker, issuing orders to phantom divisions that had no fuel, no mobility, no chance. His words carried no weight, because war is not fought with words but with movement, and movement requires gasoline. American tanks rolled into Leipzig, Nuremberg, and countless towns whose names blurred together in the advance. Columns moved so quickly that units sometimes outpaced their orders, driving until they ran low on fuel only to be resupplied hours later by convoys that seemed to appear from nowhere. The machine never stopped. For German soldiers, the sight was crushing. They fought where they could, ambushed where possible, but always they were forced back. Always they abandoned more vehicles. Always they lost ground to an enemy that could not be slowed. In late April, American and Soviet forces met on the Elbe, a handshake across a river that symbolized the end. Germany was split, its armies shattered, its cities burning. The Reich, that had once dreamed of domination, had been defeated by numbers, by production, by the flow of oil that never ceased. In Berlin, Hitler chose suicide over surrender, a final gesture of defiance that changed nothing. The war was over because the means to fight it had vanished. When victory was declared in May, American soldiers looked back on months of relentless advance and realized that fuel had been their constant companion. It had powered every jeep and every tank, every truck and every generator. It had been the silent soldier, the invisible weapon that turned the tide. Without it, even the bravest charge would have faltered. With it, the road to Berlin had been inevitable. The Battle of the Bulge had proven the point in winter snow, and the crossing of the Rhine had proven it again in spring floods. Modern war belonged to the side that never ran dry. The Reich had gambled everything on one last strike, hoping to steal what it could not produce. The Americans had answered with abundance, with convoys that never stopped, with oceans of oil that flowed like rivers of victory. The war in Europe ended not only with guns and bombs, but with the roar of engines that never fell silent until the last battle was fought and the last mile was crossed. The guns fell silent in May, but the echoes of the war lingered in every ruined town, every field littered with burned-out machines, every road still scarred by the tracks of endless convoys. Victory in Europe was celebrated with parades, flags, and cheers, yet among soldiers and commanders there was also reflection. The war had been decided not by a single battle nor by a single weapon, but by a constant, invisible force that had carried the armies forward: fuel. American generals spoke of it openly. Eisenhower admitted that logistics had been his greatest weapon, greater even than tanks or aircraft. Bradley told his staff that the war had been won on wheels. Patton, in his blunt manner, declared that battles are fought with weapons but won with gasoline. What they all recognized was that modern war was no longer the contest of nations measured only by courage or strategy, but by industry, supply, and the ability to sustain movement. The German army had learned this lesson too late. In the Ardennes, it had gambled everything on the hope of capturing Allied fuel. When that failed, the offensive collapsed, and with it, the last dream of prolonging the war. From then until the surrender, the story repeated itself: tanks without fuel, planes without aviation spirit, trucks abandoned by the roadside. The Reich had not been defeated only by superior numbers, but by arithmetic, by the simple fact that it could not feed its machines. For American soldiers, abundance became memory. They remembered idling their engines through long winter nights, remembered convoys stretching beyond the horizon, remembered gasoline cans stacked like pyramids along every road. They recalled how fuel made possible the miracles of relief at Bastogne, the dash to the Rhine, the seizure of Remagen, the sweeping drive into central Germany. They remembered, too, how the enemy faltered, how prisoners spoke endlessly of shortages, how abandoned tanks marked the path of retreat. Civilians across Europe remembered differently. For them, the arrival of American convoys brought not only liberation, but astonishment. Villagers who had scraped for firewood saw trucks left idling with engines running freely. Families who had endured hunger watched soldiers brew coffee on gasoline stoves and hand out chocolate bars as though they were nothing. The contrast between scarcity and abundance was so great that it became a story in itself, passed down long after the war as proof of the wealth and power that had come from across the ocean. When the war ended, analysts and historians tried to measure what had mattered most. Some pointed to technology: the Sherman tank, the Mustang fighter, the B-17 bomber. Others to strategy: the landings at Normandy, the coordination of Allied armies, the pressure from east and west. Yet beneath all of these ran the same truth: none of it could have functioned without supply. Aircraft could not fly without fuel. Tanks could not maneuver without gasoline. Divisions could not survive without convoys bringing rations, ammunition, and every necessity of modern war. Logistics was not the support of strategy. It was strategy. The Germans had once believed themselves masters of mechanized warfare, inventors of blitzkrieg, prophets of movement. Yet their brilliance had always been undermined by shortage. In Poland, in France, even in Russia, their victories had burned fuel faster than their reserves allowed. By 1944, the Reich was strangled, its synthetic plants smashed, its access to oil fields severed, its armies forced to rely on hopes and miracles. The Ardennes had been their last hope of stealing abundance. When it failed, the end became certain. For the Allies, the lesson endured long after the surrender. They saw that wars of the future would be decided not only by armies in the field, but by the factories and refineries that sustained them. They built plans and alliances around supply, around the idea that victory was a matter of keeping the lifeblood of war flowing. The pipelines laid across Europe, the convoys that crossed oceans, the depots that rose overnight, these were remembered as the real engines of triumph. Among the ruins of Europe, Soldiers sometimes paused to look at the wreckage and understand what it meant. Rows of German tanks stood silent, their turrets cold, their engines rusting. Aircraft lay broken on airfields, never destroyed in combat but left unfueled, abandoned to the elements. Trucks without gasoline rotted in barns and fields. The war had left behind a graveyard of machines that had not been beaten in battle, but had simply run out of the power to move. It was a sight more eloquent than any speech. Proof that an army without fuel is no army at all. American convoys still rumbled even after victory, carrying supplies for occupation, delivering food to civilians, transporting prisoners. Soldiers joked that the trucks would never stop, that gasoline had become as constant as the air they breathed. Yet in their humor lay recognition. They knew that without those trucks, without those rivers of fuel, the war might have dragged on, might have been lost. Their triumph rested not only on bravery in foxholes or courage in assaults, but on the men who drove endlessly through night and danger to deliver the cans that kept the army alive. The memory of the Ardennes lingered especially. In those snowy woods, the contrast had been starkest. The Germans had surged forward at first, their tanks roaring, their plans bold, but within days their fuel was gone. Engines sputtered, columns halted, momentum vanished. Meanwhile, American trucks drove endlessly, their convoys carving paths through snow, their depots glowing like lanterns in the winter dark. That battle had shown more clearly than any other that modern war was won, not by who struck first, but by who could keep striking. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was finished, and attention shifted to the Pacific. Yet even there, the lesson repeated itself. Fleets moved only because of oil tankers, planes flew only because of fuel, armies advanced only when supplied. The story was universal, as true in jungles and oceans as in forests and rivers. Victory belonged to the side that never ran out. When veterans spoke years later, they remembered comrades lost, battles fought, hardships endured. But many also remembered the gasoline. They laughed about the taste of exhaust, the smell of oil on their uniforms, the endless sight of fuel cans stacked higher than men. They remembered how supply gave them confidence, how abundance made them fearless. They knew, even if they could not put it into words, that they had fought not only with rifles and tanks, but with the invisible strength of a nation's industry. Germany had gambled everything on one last blow in the Ardennes. It had hoped to split the Allies, to seize their depots, to break their will. Instead, it revealed its own weakness, its dependence on resources it could no longer command. The Americans had answered not with brilliance, but with abundance, with convoys that never stopped, with engines that never fell silent. In the end, that was the true story of the war in Europe, a contest of supply lines, and the victory of the side that could keep its machines alive until the enemy's machines died. The fields of Belgium and Germany grew green again with spring, but scattered across them lay the rusting hulks of abandoned tanks, silent memorials to a truth that could not be denied. War in the 20th century was a matter of movement, and movement was a matter of fuel. Those who had it advanced, those who did not collapsed. In that difference lay the fate of nations, the destiny of armies, and the end of a Reich that had once dreamed of ruling the world but had run dry before it could reach its goal. And so, when the war ended and peace returned, one lesson remained above all others. In modern battle, courage may win moments. Strategy may win campaigns, but only fuel wins wars.